Thank you, Guillaume. So yes, my name is Christophe Tissier. I'm technical advisor in SEMA, which is the European organization of manufacturers of agricultural machinery. And indeed, I was asked to give a presentation on the international projects we are following at our level. But first, maybe a political point. What is really important for our organization is to promote early regulation and for manufacturers. And when I use the word mean, I mean having some flexibility for manufacturers when they design and produce some machines. Behind this word, we are talking about the compliance, the conformity of a product when it's placed on the market. And there are two main ways to prove the conformity of a product. Either there is self-certification or there is validation through type approval. Type approval means that all the technical requirements are already set. There is not much freedom for manufacturers for using new technologies, and this is why we are really promoting self-compliance. In the case of the safety of machinery in particular, the machinery regulation promotes actually the self-compliance, and it's important for the network of our manufacturers to keep with these principles. So we want to avoid, for example, national initiatives which would impose, for example, to get subsidies, to have additional validation tests done by external testing labs, which would generate some kind of trade burden. So, as I mentioned, the machinery regulation has really this principle of self-compliance. And for us, what is really changing with the emergence of autonomy is the relation between the machine and its operator. So the training is one part which needs also to be highly focused on and to be reviewed. And for young farmers, training needs also to be modified and take into account all these autonomous operations. So the principle of the machinery regulation, last year I had done some presentation on 3 regulations in particular on the machinery regulation, but just to remind that, actually Guillaume was mentioning it, we have at the present time the machinery directive, so directive 203/42, which applies till the 19th of January 2027, and then the next day we have the new machinery regulation, so regulation 2023/1230, which will apply. This new regulation contains actually additional technical requirements which take into account new technologies, which includes, of course, autonomy. And Cedric was mentioning, it introduces the role of supervisor, and it provides also some additional requirements for what we call the supervisory function. So when we have a supervisor which will use the machine in autonomous mode, and then there are some rules which are set in this regulation. Just as a reminder, when you want to comply with the machinery regulation, first you need to do a risk assessment where you will identify the hazardous situations, the hazards to which your product will be subject, and to mention the technical solutions you will provide on your machine to solve or to mitigate at least these hazards identified. And the machinery regulation is a regulation which gives essential health and safety requirements. So it means there are the targets to reach for a manufacturer. Of course, there are some. The manufacturer is then free to identify and to choose the technical solutions he wants to provide on his machine to satisfy these targets. But one way to comply with the machinery regulation is the use of standards, and are called, in this case, harmonized standards. It's one way, but it's not the only one. Then there is a freedom for the manufacturer to choose between the existing harmonized standards or to use one of the solutions he has in mind, if he prefers, compared to the one which are described in the harmonized standard. The regulation, the machinery regulation, is a mandatory text. You have to comply with it, or the machinery directive, depending on the time where you have to comply with. But the standard is optional. It's voluntary. It's important to remind it. And for the safety of autonomous functions, we have already, it was published last year, we have a series of standards which deals with the safety of autonomous functions. So the purpose is a compliance with the machinery directive at the present time. It's split in 4 different parts. So it gives general design principles for safety. You have the first part, which deals with design principles and vocabulary. The second part is dealing with obstacle protective systems. The third part is dealing with autonomous operating zones. And the fourth part is dealing with validation and verification and validation principles. These standards, or this series of standards, actually provide very general principles and all the items you need to take into account when you design. It will not get in a deep level of details. And of course, it needs to be completed by technical solutions which are really applicable to a specific use case. And this is actually the work we are trying to do at the present time at SEMA level, where we now are focusing on use cases. And the first work actually we have done was to identify what are the use cases which are the most used at the present time for the machine which are developed and which start to be placed on the market. So what we identified as a priority list was first soil working, which includes the work of the soil and weeding. Then we identified seeding as a second priority. Compared to the first case, seeding includes also some loading actions. And the third priority we have identified is spraying. So the first 2 items are really mechanical action compared to the third one, which involves a chemical action. So the target of our work is to be able to provide, to prepare a harmonized standard, but developed in an international, on an international level. And the target is to be able to submit something by mid of this year, or maybe end of this year. The work has been postponed, although we had many meetings and many calls. Well, the principle, yes, just to remind the principle of the safety approach. First, we need at design level to I would say to delete the risk, or at least to mitigate it. And then, as a second step, if we cannot by design remove the issue, then we have to protect. For example, if we have a blade, of course, we cannot remove the blade by design. It needs to carry out the task. So then we have to provide maybe a guard, but not fully closed. And if still there is a hazard, then we get to the conclusion that it's what we call a residual risk, and then we need to provide an information and a warning on the machine to inform the operator that there is a risk. So the approach of our work in the SEMA group, because we had a small group completely allocated to the work. As I mentioned, the principle we started from a risk assessment, and it was we really started from a blank paper. So we really tried to identify all these hazardous events which could happen. We tried to take into account all the possibilities of dimensions, of actions that could be done by machines we had identified for soil working. And based on that, once we had identified these hazardous situations, we try to quote the possibility for an accident, for hazard resulting from these events, based on the occurrence, the frequency, the severity, and the possibility to avoid actually an accident. So based on this quotation, we got to the conclusion, we found out what could be really the risks associated to a machine. And what we did in parallel to this work was to get through so the technical content of the machinery regulation. So we went through all the sections to ensure that we had not forgotten through our exercise with the hazardous events, that we had not forgotten one section of the machinery regulation, to be sure that at the end we will be able to cover all the sections of the machinery regulation. So I give two examples. One is obvious, is a contact with an obstacle. Another hazardous situation we had identified is the start of a tool when the machine is at standstill. So then, based on this starting point, we identified some scenarios, and so we try to understand whether it would really happen or not. And then once this risk assessment was done and when identified the risk associated to our soil working use case, we relied on the ISO 18497 series. So as I mentioned, which provides the general design principles. And also we used the existing standard dealing with conventional equipment. There are two screens, so now I'm discovering there is one here. And then we identified whether we need to describe specific technical solutions for our equipment. The idea actually is on our side is to provide a mature text. So one text for which at least manufacturers agree and are really in line before we submit it to ISO. This is why actually this work has been postponed because we want to investigate much more and to be sure that what we provide in terms of technical requirements, but also in terms of validation, is solid enough. And so thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Christophe. We have time and a few minutes for question if needed, if you want. So is there any question? I don't know if the microphone. Yes, it works. So is there a question for Christophe? Yes.
Thank you. Hi. This is Raffaele Giaffreda from Agri-Food Theft Project. I was wondering if there is a separation between the world of big agricultural machinery manufacturers and the small ones, the ones that, well, we've seen many of them these days doing demos. Because it looks like from the regulation standpoint, these are things that big companies can easily afford in terms of testing, in terms of validating solutions before going to market. But what about the needs and the requirements of smaller companies that, you know, just perhaps are not particularly equipped to undergo such a strong testing and validation? And what is your take from Sim as well, and what is to be done by those companies that are a little bit smaller in size?
Actually, no. In our group, actually, we have manufacturers of big companies, but also small companies. And the ones who are among the ones who are very active, we have also small manufacturers. So we tried, when I mentioned having maturity, it's to be sure also that all the network we are representing, of course, is okay with the requirements and the test and the validation we are providing in our proposal. But it will be an industry proposal. Then when it goes to ISO, then will be other parties present. There will be also other manufacturers present. And then there will be, again, some discussions. But first, we want to be sure that at least for the European network we are representing, the content is acceptable.
Thank you. Is there another question? No? I have a question, Christophe.
Yeah. Okay.
As you just mentioned, the work is prepared in CIMA, which is the European Manufacturer Association. So with the view concerning the European regulation, and it will be proposed to ISO, as you mentioned, with other manufacturers or other stakeholders. Did you, in your working group, already anticipate what would be the position of the view for the other I would say, world manufacturers
environment,
because we are concentrate on the European regulation. And do you think the approach is suitable for all the world autonomous machinery?
Okay. On autonomy, actually in SEMA we had well, several years ago there was an intent to ensure that what we would propose at international level would be accepted by other regions, and actually there was an agreement to work also with the American, the US organization of manufacturers, as well as with the Japanese organization. So our group is not only, on this case, European, it's wider than that. And when I was mentioning also maturity, it includes this aspect, which is to be sure that at least for well, I couldn't say international industry, but an extended level of industry, it could be accepted.
Thank you.
Thinking of what you were saying previously, maybe I could rebound. You were talking about on-road, on-road use. Indeed, we have a regulation dealing with self-propelled machinery, which was published at the beginning of this year, which includes the possibility of having machines without driver. So it means autonomous self-propelled machinery. It's a framework. It does not provide some technical requirements for that at the present time. But we have, for example, an example of an autonomous machine which was homologated as a towed equipment to be able to circulate on the road. So it will be towed on a tractor, and it will be driven, and it will not work autonomously. I think this example is interesting because it shows that if you want to project the split we have at the present time between a tractor, a trailer, a towed equipment, and self-propelled machinery for the conventional equipment, and if we want to project that into autonomous products, it will not work. We have to start from a blank paper and really to think again about how we should consider these products under the legal framework for autonomy. So it's a work we have initiated in SEMA. It will take some months before we can provide and we can propose some answers on our side.
Thank you very much, Christophe. Thank you. You can applause Christophe. Thanks for your presentation. So after this presentation on European initiative, we will welcome Stuart McClement, Technical and Standard Director at AEA in UK. So, as you all know, UK is not part of European European Union anymore. So we will have an example of an initiative at a national level regarding autonomous machinery. So, Stuart, the floor is yours.
Automatic. Okay, very good. Yes, good morning. Thank you very much, Guillaume. My name is Stuart McClement, Technical Director at the Agricultural Engineers Association in the UK. My previous life, before I started working at the AEA, I spent nearly 20 years working for Kubota Corporation in various roles. So my views, my approach to regulatory work is very much based on the global scale rather than on a national scale. So, firstly, who are the AEA? We're very much like AXIMA, maybe a little smaller in personnel. We started in 1875, so this year it's 150 years we have been running. So we will be having some very big parties in London later this year to celebrate this fact. We represent manufacturers and importers of farm equipment, outdoor equipment, outdoor power equipment, and also the ATV sector as well, which in itself is quite a complex area. We currently have 130 members of the AEA, and the combined turnover of our members is £3.4 billion sterling. My department, the technical department, we monitor and advocate for our members within the UK, within the EU via SEMA as well. And we also work deeply on ISO, CEN and British standards. One of the important things we do, and I wasn't planning on speaking for a long time about Brexit, but as I'm here and I'm not in the UK, it's a topic which needs to be touched on when it comes to regulation. Our role very much now looks in two directions. Up until 2016, we just looked to the Commission and Brussels and took our guidance from there. But now very much we have to look at Brussels still, but also we need to keep our eye on what's happening in London at a national basis, because there are some interesting ideas which get floated around, many of which we need to stop or try and stop as quickly as we can. Others we need to encourage. When the vote, the so-called Brexit vote, I've tried to stop calling it that, in 2016 happened, I remember attending meetings in Brussels, and it was very much people going, my God, you're all going to go off in a different direction from where we're going, and it's going to cause chaos. Actually, what's happened, which we didn't foresee at the time, is we've actually got what's termed passive divergence from the UK to the EU. So the whole regulatory world is pretty much a, dare I say it, Christoph, an industry in itself, and it keeps moving forwards. So the work in Brussels on legislation never stops. It's always pushing on and progressing, amending. What's turned out to be the case is that within the UK, after we voted to depart the EU, new legislation kind of stopped. Nothing progressed within legislation. And this has been quite an important 5-year period, I would say, in the European sphere. We have the AI Act, Cybersecurity Act, Data Act, the new machinery regulation, which has been mentioned several times. All these items have progressed. In the UK, they have not. So we have passively diverged by doing nothing. Europe has moved on in new directions. So we do have quite a different approach when it comes to AI within the UK. I won't dive down into the AI Act, etc. But just to say, the approach on AI is different. The approach on cybersecurity is different from what's been happening in the EU. In fact, we don't even have any cybersecurity legislation in progress at the moment. It's due to be laid in Parliament later this year. The Data Act, we have a similar piece of legislation which is just starting to go through our parliamentary process. And as for the machinery regulation, we're not even starting to look at this. One area I think where maybe we've gone a bit beyond, and although we are all trying desperately to hold off the excitement of autonomous farm machinery on the road, we do have the Autonomous Vehicles Act, which has actually laid out where the government or UK legislation views where the liability and responsibilities lie for autonomous vehicles on the road. There's nothing specific in there about agricultural machinery or agricultural vehicles, but it is a precursor in as much as it does mention in there that it opens the door for tractors type approved under 167, their type approval regulation, to be amended to allow for autonomous use on the roads. That, I think, will be many, many years down the road. They've basically gone through the list of type approval schemes, but the foundation is sitting there within UK legislation waiting to be acted on. The past 5 years in particular, the amount of information which we've had to disseminate from the UK government and try and pass on to our members has been enormous. And it's always changing, because they come up with an idea and then industry goes back to them and say the idea is not very good, so the idea changes slightly. So it's morphing, it's in a state of flux, which is quite interesting for me as somebody working regulations, but it also gives industry the opportunity to try and mould the final piece of legislation to suit our needs. So that's all I'm going to say on Brexit. I could go on for about 3 hours and 120 PowerPoint slides, but I won't. It's a bit of a minefield we've got ourselves into. One of the things which has happened is that it has made people, for one reason or another, start to think slightly in a different mindset. You'll have some people, not wishing to lay my politics on the line, but having come from a global corporation, I want to follow what's happening in Europe. I know what the supply chain is for equipment coming into the UK. We need our regulations to match what's happening in Europe. But there are others who do start to think outside of the box without necessarily understanding what big global manufacturing looks like and how it works. And part of this new thinking, somebody came up with the idea that we wanted a British standard for a code of conduct for autonomous machinery. One of my roles is I am chair of 2 of the BSI committees for agricultural product. So this ended up sitting in a subcommittee of my main committee. So I duly decided to follow this, and very pleased I did, because it stopped some difficult or wrong decisions being made during the process. As I mentioned, legislatively, we're not exactly on the same page as in the EU. We do work in a kind of parallel universe now. We will accept CE marked products still in the UK. And hopefully when the new machinery regulation comes in, we and many other sectors have been lobbying government to continue to allow the CE marking against the new machinery regulation for products coming in. That's not a giver yet. That's coming through in legislation right now through government. But what it's also opened up is that we decided, rightly or wrongly, that initially we weren't going to accept the CE mark. We were going to make our very own mark, thing called the UKCA mark. And that's being created in the UK. You will see it on some products. You might see it stamped on products around Europe now, because it's just going through the same marking process. But what it does open up is the opportunity to place products on the market of Great Britain, which might not necessarily, or it might be easier to facilitate pushing them on that market than on the market of the EU. kind of where I see the UK CA marking being used, possibly in our industry, is for the design and trial on a big scale of new technologies. So we won't be bound, I know we're not bound by the same AI Act requirements, for instance. It's a relatively light touch procedure that we have. We don't have the machinery regulation. We're still sitting with the old machinery directive. So there might be, probably the government wouldn't like me to say this, might be the opportunity to use GB as a sandbox environment to run equipment in. So when we started this standard, British Standard 8646, this was very much pushed by the manufacturers of this equipment, which generally isn't the big green, orange, yellow manufacturers you see in the fields. It was also driven by the universities, by the agricultural institutions, so the National Farmers Union were particularly keen on this. And one of the key players who were in the room when we went through the drafting was our Health and Safety Executive, which is the Market Surveillance Authority within the United Kingdom. And with those key players in the room, we knew we weren't going to have somebody a year after we'd finished complaining about something we'd written. So the idea was that it was going to provide a recognised path for the safe integration of autonomous machinery into the farm setting. So this was very much the framework for the standard came from the Australian Code of Conduct, which you may well have seen, and expanded upon that, and also amended because farming in Australia is very different from farming in small fields in the UK. So the standard describes what we believe is the best practice for safety and risk assessment to be applied when integrating this equipment. It provides information on the instructions and training for the safe operation that will need to be provided to those people who come into contact with this equipment. And importantly, it advises on the planning, the farm planning, including the hazards created by other people, animals, machinery in the area that the equipment's being operated in. So the document is primarily intended for owners and operators of autonomous mobile machinery, which isn't naturally in my area. I usually work with manufacturers and importers, but it's a key stepping stone to get this equipment out there and being used in the marketplace. It's definitely a document which manufacturers and designers probably need to read to understand the steps which are going to have to be taken by the end user when they integrate this equipment into their farm setting. And it'll also assist those responsible in purchasing in making sure that the manufacturer can supply whatever information is required to get this equipment safely integrated. One of the key points about BS 8646 is it does not contain any technical requirements for machinery. This is something which I'm very pleased I was in the room when we were drafting this, because as Christophe Tissier mentioned, we have ISO 18497, which was published, I think, last summer or the summer before. And some of the basic, not the very granular level, but the very basic technical requirements are in there. And it's very important when we start drafting information for end users and manufacturers especially when there are people in the room who don't have experience of the wider, more global way of drafting standards, that people don't get too excited and they start drafting new definitions and new ways of having lights flashing, etc. So it's very much a non-technical document. It's all about risk assessment and integration. So usually when we draft a piece of legislation, sorry, I've gone backwards or forwards. Usually when we draft a piece of legislation, it's very important to look at the very first page where it says scope. What does this cover? And so I'll try and get back on the next slide. What does the standard cover? I've gone out with the slide, sorry. What does the standard cover? But more importantly, when you look at standards and legislation, what does it not apply to? What this doesn't apply to is any stationary equipment, any conventional manual automated equipment or non-automated equipment, unmanned aerial systems, or drones as we're calling them nowadays. They're out of scope. Machinery which is still directly controlled by a human operator, whether it's located on the machine or in a remote location. Autonomous machinery operating on a mechanically fixed path, so it's just trundling up and down. A glass house, and forestry machinery. And the question always comes up about whether it covers what's going on the road. The answer is no, it does not. So as Guillaume mentioned, the piece about crossing the road to go between fields, the piece about going up and down a farm track, these are still very complicated. It sounds stupid, but they're very complicated areas in law as to what is a road. Does the road going up to the farmhouse, is that a road or is that private? These are questions which are, need to be really carefully thought through. Another piece which we had to really focus on, which is probably in other member states of the EU, but not across the EU, will be footpaths, the right of access across fields. In the UK, you can't put a gate across. You can't block it, so you have to take some other action. So this is why we can do it on a national basis. But I know previously we have tried to draft something many years ago on a European-wide basis, and it got very difficult when you get to these topics about what is a road, who's going to be in the field. So, sorry, my slides are caught up. So the standard or the code of conduct itself is really there to assist the end user in the integration into the farm setting, and to walk them through each step of the risk assessment process to ensure that it is integrated in a safe manner. And it's really built on standard risk assessment and processes which have been well documented, but it brings all the areas into one document, so you're not having to try and guess as to what you should be actually looking at. So it identifies the hazards, so the operating parameters of the machine, how it's going to be used in semi or fully autonomous mode, its work environment, whether it's going to be in the field, the yard, a glass house, whether there's going to be pedestrian movements, people walking across the fields, right of way, And also the work practices outside of the actual use of the machine, the cleaning of the machine, maintenance, repair of the machine as well. It shows how to assess the risks as to who is going to be harmed and how they might be harmed, what risks are already, what risk controls are already in place, so they don't have to be looked at again. Importantly, who has responsibility for these? Responsibility and liability, I think, are key questions when it comes to autonomous machinery. And when action is really required, whether it's required constantly, whether it's going to be required occasionally, or even just once a year, once a season. How to control the risks, which Christoph touched on, whether you just remove the risk altogether. There are various levels on how you deal with risk, elimination, reduction, provision of PPE, so protection equipment, training, supervision, for example, and then finally, whether any warning signs need to be put up to warn people in the setting where the machine's being used of what's happening. And the piece which often gets forgotten in the excitement, I suppose, of doing a risk assessment, if doing a risk assessment can be exciting, is actually recording what you've done. How to record it, what you've identified, and importantly, when you're going to come back and review what you've done, because the basis of risk assessment is it's not a one-off job that you complete. You go back and you revisit your risk assessment, and it explains how to do that and how to improve the risk assessment beyond that. It looks at the farm planning of the machine, farm planning for the use of the machine. So considerations as to the machine's limitations, the area it's going to be working in, its interactions with people, whether they're trained or non-trained, just wandering through the farm, or people from government agencies come onto the farm. The location of the infrastructure, so not only power, but also where the supplies are, so fertilizer, etc., where that's going to be stored with. And also the hazards with commissioning of these machines. The vehicle transport between fields, which we kind of touched on, that is one piece which is now being revised. We're drafting again in that area, and what's required when we come to maintain and repair this machine. The piece which is often forgotten, if you have a fire in the farmyard, etc., how you deal with emergencies. And then finally, there are a number of annexes at the back which go into great detail and lay out the points which need to be looked at by the person carrying out the risk assessment. So this is very much a British document. It can be purchased from British Standards online. I'm sure this will be shared after today. Here's the link to British Standards, but also the direct link to the standard if you wish to purchase it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stuart. We have the time for one or two questions. Is there any question from the audience? No? So a question from my side, Stuart. So it is a standard published at a national level. It addresses topics for users, I would say. In which way the association, farmer association, or other stakeholders act in order the standard to be read, to be adopted by the users? It is known, this document. So
yes, this has been promoted by the National Farmers Union and amongst its members, and it was in the press. But you're right, Guillaume, it's very difficult to advertise a standard outside of BSI. So it's very much word of mouth beyond the National Farmers Union and BSI, but it is because the people drafting it are very much involved in the industry of autonomous machinery. I believe it will also come out through the universities and the health and safety executive.
Okay, thank you. A question from the audience? No? No questions, so everything was clear. So thank you very much, Stuart. Thank you very much. So now we will have a short break, and we will continue with panel discussion at 10:30. So thank you.